Hi, Kim.
Hi, Janice. How are you?
I'm good. It's so nice to meet you.
I know. I feel like this is the only way we'll be meeting people for a little bit.
I know you look great, and I like the
Oh, thank you.
background with the books. Love the red lip.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I generally used to work from home, but I had to figure out my actual thing that I want people to see all the time. I don't think I actually gave it that much thought. I had like a white background for a minute.
Yeah, that's no, I love it, and I wish I had a nice bookshelf. And I like the plant. It's a good visual.
Oh, thank you. I know someone who did this kind of bananas thing where they have a room and it looks like they have bookshelves, but
Mhm.
it's actually like a fake backdrop. It's
Oh,
like a cloth that drops
yeah.
down in front of
Oh,
the window.
I see it. That's what I need. I definitely need
Yeah.
that because I, for some reason, Zoom won't let me do the green screen.
I can't do it either.
Okay. So I'm like
Yeah.
trying to change but it just will not let me do that. So I'm like, all right.
I'm also not a huge fan because it has like a weird halo thing that happens around your
Oh yeah.
face.
Yeah.
And I always find it distracting because I'm like, it's hard to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
But
I'm
this looks
so
great.
excited. Well, thank you. I have like laundry in the corner, but you can't really but I'm so excited. Someone actually this morning tagged me in a post
Mm.
that a Asian woman put up a post about one of the officers who
Yeah.
happened to be Asian,
Mhm.
and she was saying that she was debating whether she wanted to post the picture or not, but she ended
Yeah.
up posting it. And someone who's actually going to be attending the diversity dinner was like, this is so timely that this
Yeah.
diversity dinner is taking place. And a lot of people reached out to me and just were really excited. Someone messaged me just now on LinkedIn, and I'm forgetting the name, and she said, oh, I've worked with Kim before and she's amazing. So
Oh,
really
that's so
excited about it.
lovely.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think, I was talking to my partner about this, and my partner does a lot of organizing work out here. And I didn't expect 100 something people. I think I expected like, you had kind of level set at 50. And I was like, okay, so like 50 is a good turnout. And since the protests have started, and since I think a lot of folks in the last few months especially have been asking about what we kind of make of increased anti-Asian racism and then anti-blackness that's kind of always been there. um my partner was like, it's really not surprising that everyone wants to talk about this
Hmm.
you
Yeah,
know
this was actually, I mean, we only advertised it for 1 week, and it's actually the highest number of tickets anyone has gotten for any of the diversity dinners that I did. And I did one last week with a woman named Karen
yeah,
Fleshman, and we talked about how Black women and white women can come together for
yeah.
collective allyship, and that had a lot of interest. But this one was almost 200 tickets, so that's
Wow.
really exciting that there was so much interest in it. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited to just talk to you. And also, like, you have a research background, and I always love talking with people who do research because I just find that there's so much great historical context
Yeah.
as well that you can bring. So I think it'll be a really good discussion.
Yeah, me too. I forget, I know you have a doctorate. I actually don't know what your doctorate's in or where you did your work.
It's in organizational psychology.
Oh, great. Where were you? Yeah, where did you do your research?
I was at Hofstra University.
Yeah.
So I did my dissertation focused on hiring and selection bias. So if you reveal things, an invisible identity to an employer, if
Yeah.
that impacts your likelihood to be hired, and
Mhm.
also how you frame the invisible identity, I also found impacts your likelihood to be hired. So if you, for example, have a mental illness and say that it's because you had an inability to control what was going on in your life, and it was stress, and if you put the onus on yourself, then of
Okay.
course the employer ranks you as less likely to lower in hireability, and you're less likely to be hired. So I thought that was really interesting. So a lot of my
Yeah.
research is selection and hiring bias.
That's awesome. I feel like we could just talk about research all day.
I know, exactly. And your research, what was your research, or what was your dissertation on?
Yeah, so someone just found my dissertation and sent me the link, and I was like, I know what I wrote. I'm fine. Like, I'm not confused by what I
Yeah.
did. So my research was on Asian American, or there's a movement across the country called Asians for Black Lives. And
Hmm.
I was working with Asian American folks, and doing ethnographies and participant
Oh.
research on what actually makes a successful cross racial coalition. Like, tell me how you did this, and like what strategies work.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, you have to all of that. We need all that information because I think that what is missing sometimes from the conversation is like the solutions
yeah.
and how we get to those solutions. So I didn't realize that that's what your dissertation was on.
Mhm.
Amazing.
Yeah, this is kind of like my lane.
Definitely. So you did a qualitative study, right?
I did ethnography, did interviews, I did participant observation because I was doing the work. And I think originally my research was something else entirely.
Mhm.
And at some point, my advisor was just like, do the thing you're doing, just
Mhm.
start taking field notes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so predominantly working with queer Vietnamese and trans Vietnamese folks.
Hmm.
And looking at a lot of the things that are happening in New York, in Philly, in Los Angeles, and in the Bay Area.
Hmm. And you're in San Francisco?
I'm in Oakland.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So here it's a lot of legacy of the Panthers
Hmm.
work, which is always really fascinating because I think the Panthers were really cross racial.
Hmm.
Like, always. The history of the Panthers is generally a lot of Black liberation, but there was a lot of bridges built. And so I'm in the place where we learn from that.
Hmm. Wow. Okay, so I just got a notification that it's 8 o'clock. So
Yay.
there's 23 people waiting right now.
Okay.
So I'm gonna start letting people in. And then
Great.
once people join in, I'm just going to, I found that if people turn their video cameras off, it frees up the bandwidth so we don't have like the freezing and the
The
stopping.
glitching. Yeah.
Yeah, I just learned that. So I think it's going to be a lot of people. So I'll just ask that once everyone arrives, that everyone turns off their
Sure.
camera.
Awesome. And
Hi, everyone.
hi, folks. Look at this. This is really exciting. Look at all your great headshots.
This is amazing. Okay. I have some interesting, so I'm like looking at YouTube comments. There's some interesting comments here.
Oh, interesting. I haven't checked out the YouTube.
Yeah, it's
If
like
there's anything you want to start with, we can.
it it's well, I think we'll get to that.
Okay.
I'm reading the comments and it's just okay. Hi, everyone.
Hi, folks.
Hi, Janice. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Congrats on your book.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited. It's like it's bittersweet because with everything going on, I am like excited, but then I'm like, it's like bittersweet.
I'm so curious about how you launch a book right now. I've seen a couple people do it, and it's totally possible. And I think the material is so important. So I'm excited to see how you move forward.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that. It's interesting, and there's going to be no like in person book events, and everything
Mhm.
has to be virtual. But I think that um, I actually think more people are like paying attention and have time to read right now
Yeah.
versus before this whole thing happened. So I think it's a good time, but I'm like torn because my energy is just like focused on what's going on. So it's like you're happy, you're sad, it's
Yeah.
everything. Thank you so much, Sheree. So Sheree, there are only I can do that for you. Yeah. I see your message. Um, so I'm just gonna give a couple more minutes. I see people are still trickling in. Hi, Ingrid. Thanks, Ingrid. Okay. So I think we should go ahead actually and get started because it's going to be a really good conversation and I don't want to take any more time away. I'm just going to periodically be checking the participants because I have to let people into the conversation. But hi, everyone. I'm so excited for this conversation. I have the lovely Dr. Kim here. This is definitely a timely conversation, a relevant conversation, but tonight we're going to be really diving into how we can build bridges and create cross-racial allyship between the Asian Pacific Islander community and Black communities. So I just wanted to really first quickly start off by saying that this earlier yesterday, I was tagged in a few posts about the one of the officers that was involved in the killing of George Floyd. And one of the officers happened to be an Asian man. And a few people were tagging me and saying, like, it's so timely and relevant that you and Dr. Kim are having this conversation because of everything that's going on. So I just found it to be really uncanny that we're having this conversation, but I'm really, really glad that we are here and that you all are here to join us. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that I realized at the last event that it slows up the bandwidth when all of us have our cameras on. So if you could just turn your cameras off unless you want to share something, then we just ask that you turn your camera on so that we don't have those annoying glitches that happen with the Zoom. So I wanted to first start off with introducing myself. My name is Janice Gassam. Some of you may be familiar with me, some of you are not familiar with me, but I do a lot of work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So companies will hire me to do workshops on racial equity and reducing microaggressions, how to get the most out of your diversity program. So most of the work that I do is within organizations on like fostering more inclusive spaces. I also am a professor. I teach courses in business, primarily in human resource management. And is my favorite course to teach is actually diversity and inclusion, which I just finished teaching. And the goal with this diversity dinner dialogue is to have these uncomfortable conversations that are really necessary to move the needle and create change. So I'm really glad that Dr. Kim is able to share her knowledge and her expertise and just in figuring out how we can build these bridges. So I wanted to allow Dr. Kim Tran an opportunity to introduce herself for those of you who are not familiar with her.
Thank you so much, Janice. I love the power of a couple doctors on the line, so I'm excited to be sharing this space with you. My name is Kim. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And in terms of the professional world, I've been doing equity, diversity, inclusion work for about 13 years. I look great for my age. So I've been here for over a decade. And I really cut my teeth thinking about a couple of things. One is, how do we push LGBTQIA inclusion beyond just what we already know? So I focus a lot on trans, non-binary, and intersex inclusion in the workplace. And my other piece is actually around thinking about cross-racial coalition, whether that's in the workplace or beyond, right? So I come in and train organizations on racial equity. I often right now am getting a lot of how do we work as Asian American communities on uprooting our anti-Blackness? And a lot of that actually comes from my research background. I have my Ph.D. in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley, and my research was an outgrowth of organizing work that I was doing in my hometown in the Bay Area. And I talked to a lot of folks who are on the ground working with Asians for Black Lives in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm really interested in things like, how do we learn from movements? How do you create successful political allegiances as communities of color, specifically as Asian Americans and Black folks?
I love that. Thank you so much, Kim, again, for being here. So I just find it really ironic that I wanted us to begin this conversation diving into sort of the history of this, I want to say, kind of tumultuous relationship between the Asian Pacific Islander community and the Black community. And I think that there's always kind of been this tension there. But I think that looking back in history, at one point that shines in my memory, where tension sort of reached a head, was in 1992 when the LA riots happened. Which I'm sure many of you on the line were familiar with and remember when that happened. And I was young when it happened, and I vaguely remember. But during that period of time, ironically, there were 4 officers who were involved in the beating up of Rodney King, who was a Black man. And those 4 officers were acquitted. And because they were acquitted, even though there was a video of them beating up Rodney King, there were the LA riots. And during the LA riots, the tensions arose between the Korean store owners and the Black people that lived within those communities. And there was a lot of looting and a lot of just rioting that was taking place, similar to what we're seeing right now in this country. And I think that was a moment or a point in history and in time when things really rise to the bubbling point between the Asian community and the Black community. And even in, I was reading some of the YouTube comments and the things that people were saying. And I think that there is, from the Black community, I think that a starting point of this conversation is, I think that there are sometimes feelings of, a lack of allyship. So when things happen to Black people, I think that sometimes as a Black person, there's feelings of, we should all be standing together as people of color, but we often don't hear or see that allyship from our Asian brothers and sisters. So I think that is part of the problem. And I wanted to just open it up to you, Dr. Kim, or anyone who really has any feedback or anything that they want to say. And I think it also goes back to this anti-Blackness that a lot of people feel from Asians. And someone told me a story today about how when you go into a beauty supply store that is owned by an Asian person, sometimes as a Black person, you're followed, or you feel like they're watching you and they don't trust you. So I think that all of these things contribute to the strained relationship between the Black and Asian community. And I don't know if, Kim, you had anything else you wanted to add on. I know you know all about the history and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing. I literally wrote my dissertation on this, but the other part of it is the reality that for so many folks, their day-to-day experience of this relationship can be really negative, right? And so the first thing I think that we have to come to terms with as an Asian American community is that anti-Blackness is a very real and very vibrant part of who and how we move through the world. Right. The model minority, actually, one of its big features is that it depends on anti-Blackness. And so when you look at our history, it is the entire kind of racialization of Asian Americans has been kind of against anti-Blackness. Like, at least we're not Black folks. And we have been socially and politically and culturally positioned in that way. And in part because of that, we have kind of created these really specific and big moments of racial harm for folks. A part of the 92 Rodney King uprisings was actually an Asian store owner who killed a young Black woman, right? And so these are all parts of our memory and our culture in America, and they're absolutely a part of Asian America and how we function and live in the world. And so I think for us, the question now is, how do we as a community want to move forward, right? And we've also seen the shadow side of that. I think that the things that we don't talk about and we don't really have a chance to acknowledge is that there has been a lot of cross-racial coalition between our communities. But, white supremacy is really interested in us thinking only through this idea that we have nothing but hostility. We have nothing but these moments of like great strife. So for me, it's always both and. It's both of these things, that Asian Americans have perpetrated a lot of racial harm, and also a lot of our organizing and solidarity with Black folks is deliberately erased by everyone. So we don't have role models, right? We don't have a place to turn. We don't have a place to look. when we're looking for Asian folks who are actually doing the work of countering that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we need to be shining a light on more of these instances of cross racial solidarity, because we need more examples of that. There is this perception, and I think that there are many groups and many people that are shattering these perceptions, but they're just not being highlighted. Sean put in the chat that he wanted to share something. So Sean, I wanted to open the floor up to you to share.
Thanks, Janice. Yeah, I just had a few things. I tend to be long-winded, so I'm gonna try to sum it up as quickly as possible. I'm a guy that I'm from, and I'm currently in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is where I was born at, but I spent the bulk of my childhood in San Diego, California. So I definitely had, and I wasn't that far removed from Southern California, when the Rodney King incident happened. And a couple other little tidbits to add to what was going on at that time. The rapper Ice Cube, he had released the album. He had talked real, and that was kind of like his transitioning into more of a political, hip hop artist. And he even had a song called Black Korea, where he was talking about the dynamics between the Black community and the Asian community. But so I've had these different experiences. Like, I went to school with a lot of Pacific Islanders. I lived, in San Diego, at least at that time, I'm about to be 43, so at that time, the demographics and as far as where people lived in San Diego, especially in like some of the more impoverished areas, like we were kind of, it's like you go to LA, like, neighborhoods are clearly defined, whether it be Black or Mexican or Asian, Little Korea, things like that. It wasn't like that in San Diego. So I had these experiences where, I played with Asian kids and Pacific Islanders and went to school and things like that. And we break danced against them, things like that. So I'm definitely dating myself now. But so now, fast forward, I moved to Wisconsin, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who is, if no one else knows on this call, has been classified as, if not one of the most segregated cities in the country, next to Chicago. So, here I am, and we stopped up in the state of Washington for like 9 months before we, Milwaukee, and that was definitely culture shock. But still, I still had a lot of San Diego in me. So just seeing how people related, and I was even pulled to the side a couple times, by Black kids, like, hey, man, this is, like you're doing too much. So anyway, but because I said I wasn't going to be that long-winded. I am happy to report, though, that there are you have Jessica Bowling, you have this is APA Heritage Month, and I've been in contact with her. So there are a number of organizations currently in Milwaukee and Wisconsin that are concentrating on celebrating their heritage, but recognizing that a lot of the common struggles and the commonalities between the Black communities and other communities that suffer from disenfranchisement, marginalization, racism, discrimination, especially in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything that especially Chinese Americans and Chinese foreign exchange students and everything that they're going through. So I just want to add that, and everything that's going on now with the George Floyd case. They were Jessica and some of her other allies and colleagues, they were they spoke out. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. There's definitely a lot of depending on where you are in the country, there's definitely still a lot of there's a long ways to go as far as and a lot of things you were speaking on, Kim. I definitely seen, not only as a college student, but just just an ordinary citizen, to where whether it be store owners in the neighborhood, or
Mhm.
just Asian Americans who have, tapped into white privilege,
Yeah.
um, so anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Sean. And that's an important piece of the conversation that we're going to
Mhm.
get back to. But Sade wanted to share something with everyone. So I'm going to go
Hey,
ahead.
thank you, Janice. Thank you, Kim, so much for this platform and being able to share. When I say I identify differently in the Black community, I usually lead with my ethnicity. I'm an African woman, born and raised in Nigeria to
Mm.
Nigerian Ghanaian parents. And my experience with the Asian community is rooted in things that I see going on the continent, which has the most
Mm.
populated Black communities. And so I worry about, just my perception, evaluation of my interactions, um, with the Asian community on the continent, um, and exactly how I transfer, my interpretation of it. So a few examples is, a Nigerian factory fire killed about 37 people, right?
Mm.
And that factory was owned by Chinese investors. And,
Right.
it has been known that Chinese investors or owners in particular will lock individuals within these factories
Mm.
overnight to work. One, to ensure that they continuously are working, because many of the times those owners don't physically stay there.
Right.
And so when I have experienced this firsthand, meaning visited these factories and seeing these things happen, and also seeing just with the response overall with COVID, 20% of Africa entire debt is really owed to China. And to have China not even or be really reserved about providing any relief, just from that perspective, from a global perspective, a global Black perspective, I get enraged. And now I am in America where I have more privileges and opportunities, and I
Mhm.
can escape from this world. And I have amazing interactions and firsthand experiences here with the Asian community. And I just don't know how to translate that. I don't know how to manage that. I don't know how to mitigate that. And I would love, more aid. And how do I empower, if at all, the Asian community to feel what I'm feeling and to take more action in the little ways that we can here in America. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Sade. Yeah, that's actually one of the questions that I wanted to open it up to, because I think that, and I'm in reading the YouTube chat, I think that it seems like the consensus, not among all Black people, but among some Black people and Africans of the diaspora, is that there is not. So I think that sometimes Black people feel like we're the most vocal whenever anything happens to any person of color,
Mhm.
whether it's Native Americans, whether it's Asians, whether it's any group. Black people are very, very vocal. We're the first out there protesting. And I think sometimes we feel like we don't get that same treatment and
Mhm.
allyship. And when things happen to us, particularly, in just reading some of the comments, it seems like people were frustrated because there was a lot of spotlight put on the way Asians are being treated since the coronavirus started, but there was not as much news coverage on how Africans in different Asian countries
Right.
are being treated. So I think that Sade poses a really great question, in that I think some of the perspectives from the Black community are, how do we get our Asian brothers and sisters to speak out more? And when I was having a conversation with someone about this person said, well, it's not in the nature of Asian people to be outspoken. And, I know that they have a saying, I believe in Japan, that something about the tallest nail is the one that gets hammered down or something. So
Mhm.
we're not, we don't encourage the squeaky wheel gets the oil type of mentality. It's more,
Yeah.
everyone has to kind of be the same. So how do we, I think, the question is, how do we get our Asian brothers and sisters to speak up when things like Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, when those situations happen? How do we get other communities, and particularly Asian Pacific Islander communities, to be more vocal?
So I hear this a lot, and I think it's always interesting to think about it from the vantage point, just like the African continent, the Asian continent is huge. There are like hundreds of countries that are affiliated and draw our heritage to this place, right? So the first thing I want to say is that this is a very diverse community, and all of us can't be boiled down into this one idea that we're subservient and quiet, right? There are definitely ways that we have been driven to be a wedge community amongst communities of color. Like that kind of carrot of maybe you could be a little bit white has always been dangling in front of us. And some people, I'll be honest, some people have taken that bait for sure. On the other side, I think that there on the Asian continent is a really beautiful legacy of revolutionaries, of fighters, of folks. I'm Vietnamese. Like I'm from a country that actually waged one of the few successful revolutions against the French and the Americans, right? And depending on how you look at it. And so one of the things that I think is really important as a way to kind of think about how do we talk to Asian folks about things like political struggle is to really, in terms of our conversation, draw folks in with things that they're experiencing, right? I wrote an article a while back about like, how do you actually talk to your family about anti-Blackness? And one of the things that has worked for me amongst my community is, let me talk to you about surviving war and surviving terror. And you know what that's like. So can we think about it from a standpoint of there is some sort of parallel that you understand around militarized violence? Because that's what's happening in the Midwest right now, right? Like the minute people launch tear gas, bring the police out, bring SWAT out, that's militarization. And that's something that a lot of Asian people understand. And that's something that we can think about taking a stand on if it's, brought in from people who are inside our community. So there, I think, are a number of strategies to invite Asian folks to think about the fact that we have experienced this and we don't have to compete about it. Like, I mean, I think it's very odd right now that there are some Asian American folks who are like, let's talk about our racism, but let's not talk about racism against anybody else. Actually, let's talk about racism against everybody. Because if we actually can think about our struggles as linked and really inextricable, then we have a place to go. Right? Your fight is important to me and my fight is important to you.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that storytelling piece, because I think storytelling in this field and in any sort of equity work is powerful, because when you're able to really put yourself in the shoes of other people or see how they're feeling or experience what they're feeling, that's when I feel like change really happens. So Dr. Parrish says, I think the spaces in which we're in can also define Black and Asian relationships. My experiences inside and outside of academia differ. And I totally agree. I think that I find a lot of allyship with the Asian people that I've come in contact with in academia. But I also have found that in some of my experiences that allyship is not always there outside of academia. And Ingrid said, and I think that this is really important. She says that I think it starts with not knowing or not having a full understanding of the historical oppression of Black people. This country has been built on the backs of Blacks, and the only beneficiaries have been whites and those immigrants who align themselves in the space of anti-Blackness. Acknowledging this is the beginning of understanding. When you come from a homogenous environment, it is a challenge to understand otherness. So Sean had brought up a really good point about the fact that some, and you also said, Kim, some Asian people align themselves with whiteness and are white adjacent. And I think that is also problematic, because there's an idea that as a person of color, you can't be racist. You can't be prejudiced because you're a person of color. You understand oppression. And I think that has also contributed to this, the straight relationship. What are your thoughts on that?
That's so interesting. Yeah, I am of a mindset that being racist requires power, and people have differential power, right? So I am Southeast Asian, and if y'all are familiar with what Asian America looks like, Southeast Asians are positioned very differently from East Asians and South Asians. That being said, I do think that people of color generally cannot necessarily be racist. That does not mean that we can't flex internalized white supremacy very, very well, right? Again, it's that question of like, can I get in a little bit if I play the game right versus I don't want to play this game anymore. The game is broken. I don't want a part of it.
It's also going back to the idea of the model minority. So I think that there's issues, or and of course I don't speak for all Black people. I'm just one Black person who also identifies as African. So I'm like kind of like Sade in that I don't speak for all Black people, but I'm just going off of conversations that I've had, and it seems like there's a perception from some Black people that Asians have it easier because Asians are the model minority, and that Asians are overrepresented in certain settings, like, in educational settings, and in some tech companies, there is a high representation of Asians. So I think that there's a perception that, people like to play the oppression Olympics, and it looks like, well, Asians don't have it as bad as we do. And so there is, I think that is contributing to a reason why the gap is that there's a perception that Asians have it better.
Yeah, I always think that's really fascinating, especially in this moment. And I'll be really forthcoming. I said this on the Grapevine YouTube show that I was on a little while ago, that up until a couple months ago, I had never had a white woman like clutch her pearls and run away from me. And the minute that happened to me, I thought I understand somewhat of an experience that has never been available to me before. Um, and instead of for me affirming that like I had to fight for just Asian people in that moment, it became traction for me to think, how do I recommit to actually uprooting all kinds of racism, right? Instead of getting bogged down into this place of us thinking that as Asian Americans, maybe we just want to kind of reaffirm some of the advantages that we have, right? Because I mean, I'll use the Bay Area as an example. In the Bay Area, in tech, Asian Americans, specifically East and South Asians, we're looking at representation about 20%, right? Black folks, 3% at best in the Bay. And so it's very disproportionate. And we have a choice to make there. We can either rally and try to get more people of color represented, period, or we can say we just want our own groups to be represented, right? And this is a moment, I think, to really double down on our efforts to create a more just world overall, not just for one group that we're identified with.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I wanted to open it up to Amber J. Said she had some thoughts that she wanted to share. So I just wanted to open it up to you, Amber.
Hi, everybody. So I think one of the thoughts that I want to share or question I would like to bring up is, so I'm African American, and I know you mentioned that you come from a African background. And I know we heard from the young lady earlier who is Nigerian. And of course, all of our Asian Americans on the call as well. So one of the things that I think about sometimes when I think about this allyship, even between African Americans and Africans, is that African Americans in this country have a very different history, literally, than everybody. We did not choose to be here. And I think that when you think about the fact that we didn't choose to be here versus everyone else who chose and made a decision to come to the United States and deal with whatever politics that happened to be in place, I think that sometimes that can be a space where there is a lack of understanding that I have seen. I've definitely seen that happen between the African and African American community because there's a lack of understanding of the work that went into place for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I believe it was, that enabled so much immigration to be able to happen in the United States. And I know that there's definitely been some feelings about, you know, from the African American community of other communities, Africans and everyone else not really acknowledging that one, that foundation that enabled other people to also get here, but also not acknowledging that the particular past that African Americans have had has put them in a particular place today.
Absolutely. And thank you, Amber. I think that's really, really important to understand. And even me as a first generation American, and my parents immigrated here from Cameroon, it's important that I recognize that my life has been easier because of the hard work that was put in by Black people that were here before my family got here. And I think that, like Ingrid said, a failure to understand and acknowledge the history contributes to the reason why there are these gaps between our communities. Is that there's a lot of Africans that don't know the history and that don't recognize all of the hard work that was put in by the Black Americans that were here. So there has to be an understanding of the history and the history of anti-Blackness. And also, like Kim said, there has to be, I think storytelling is a really important element to help people understand each other, because I think the main question is like, how do we get more allyship from the Asian community? Is part of it is that storytelling piece. And I think that will, and people are becoming more vocal. And I definitely think that I don't want to push off the people like Dr. Kim and others who are very vocal about anti-Blackness and things of that nature. But I wanted to touch on a comment. I saw this earlier and I forgot to mention it, by Lolita. So Lolita says, that she identifies as an Asian woman, and she says that if you're down for Black Lives Matter, you can be looked at negatively by Asians who don't or aren't. I don't know if Lolita, you wanted to expand a little bit on that, but I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that because I think that that's also an important point as well. And maybe Lolita walked away.
Oh, no, I'm here. I was just trying to find the unmute button. Sorry about that, everyone. So no, I was like, because I grew up mostly in a Black Hispanic neighborhood. So I mostly identify with Black people and more people of color. Like, I don't dispute that Asians have it harder, but then I also see it's easier. But when I go to say, like, I'm Filipino, so Filipino American, first generation. So I come here, and I always, when I go to Filipino parties, I hear some of the anti-Blackness, and it makes me mad, to almost to the point where I actually don't even go to Filipino parties anymore because I don't like to hear that. And when I tell them, like, that's not right to say that, because everybody has struggles, like, and if you want to have a more of a community, we all have to look out for each other. But then people argue with me, so I'm like, all right, you know what, I'm trying to get I'm just trying to enjoy myself, eat my food, and keep going. So I've learned, like, all right, I'm just not going to say anything. And I feel bad because I do care about the Asian about the things, especially with the coronavirus right now, because that also in some ways affects me, you know, if I happen to walk down the street. But then when I hear it, it's really frustrating. So I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to talk much about, like, I have made posts about that, say, you know, all racism is wrong no matter what, but we do need to look out for each other. And I just don't know how can, and that's why I want to join today's post, because I want to hear, like, how can we bridge that gap so I can be, you know, I can be down for all types of racism, not just, you know, one or the other. Like, I don't think I should be looked at like, oh, I don't care about my Filipino culture because I care for Black Lives Matter too. I don't think that's fair, you know? So it's like I'm straddling two sides. So I don't know what to say about it, you know? So
Yeah. If I can, Janice, I'd love to speak to that. Listen, y'all, I'm in my 30s and I'm listening to a lot of Brene Brown. So I'll start with, I listen to a lot of Brene Brown. But there's a Brene Brown quote that's actually, I think, really helpful in thinking about how things are challenging when we talk about race. And she says, when we name and own hard things, it doesn't give them power, it gives us power. And talking about anti-Blackness in Asian communities gives us power, right? It gives us the ability to see it, to name it, and then to work through it. And it is really hard because this is a historical relationship. Asian folks were brought in as intermediary labor. We were paid low, but we got paid, so we weren't slaves, right? And as someone who teaches about the history of communities of color in the United States, it is really hard to introduce folks to the concept of chattel slavery, to the concept of genocide, to any of the hard things that have happened to communities of color in this country. That being said, the further you go back, the more you realize that it took centuries of learning the system to get us here. And it's going to take a long time to get us out, which is why I really encourage folks to push hard with their families, but to also take space, because you're not going to get a great response if you come at them hard at every barbecue. You know, maybe you want to take a beat, maybe not at the church donut thing, you know. With my mother, it has taken, and also my mother's a refugee. She raised me on her own. I grew up poor. I grew up in a hard way. And my mother is a wonderful person. She's an organizer. She works with formerly incarcerated men and has for 15 years. Even my mom has a hard time with this. And it takes colonialism. It takes like centuries of learning for us to get to a place where my mom has these beliefs. And so I come at her with a lot of compassion, a lot of gentleness, and honestly, I try to come up with as much empathy as I can for her and for me in these conversations, right? You have to play your game, not another person's game. Like, I don't have a PhD to my mom. Like, I'm her little girl. So I don't come at my mom with research from the Pew Center. I just will not work. Right. So you use the relationships that you have with people, and you don't have to do this all the time, but we have to do it.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. And your families are some of the, and I was reading the comments and I saw that someone was saying that they were also Filipino, and that I'm trying to find it, but yeah, so I think the families are really important. I see Sean said, I dated a Filipino woman that was broad-minded for the most part, but I still had to educate her and reminded her and her friends about what was appropriate and what wasn't. And I think that sometimes it's not always the younger generation, it's the older generation. And you might have to educate your grandfather or grandmother or your mother or your father, because there is, you know, a lot of anti-Blackness within the older generations as well. And, you know, I hear these stories a lot of people having to educate their parents and their families. But I think that it's having the conversations. People don't want to have the conversations because it's going to make people uncomfortable, but you have to be willing to sit in that uncomfortability, because nothing is going to change if you hear your family or your sister or your brother saying something that's anti-Black or doing something that's anti-Black, and you don't do anything. And you're like, well, you know, they don't mean any harm by it. They're not racist. I think that in being complicit, you're contributing to that system of white supremacy. So I think that when, you know, to answer your question, Lolita, to say, speaking from the Black perspective and just one person, I think that I would like to see more vocalness coming from my Asian brothers and sisters. I would like to see, you know, when things happen, something as simple for me as like a post. It makes me happy to see people acknowledging the wrongdoing that's happening. And I think that when I scroll onto my Instagram and I see people posting meals and I see people posting just, it makes me feel like you don't care. And how can you ignore something that I think is like shoved in everybody's face? So I think that in a sense is frustrating. Or have you checked on your Black friends? Have you checked on your Black coworkers? How, you know, so like,
I mean, Go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Like,
I just
how
had a
do you
comment.
call yourself an ally and you haven't even checked up on the people who are seeing Black bodies over and over and over again getting killed and getting, so like I think that in asking yourself like how to be an ally, if any of you are Asian on this call and you're asking how do I be an ally to the Black community, I think showing up is important. We want to see you show up, no matter how uncomfortable it is.
I would say this too. I mean, I like to say that when we're thinking about social change, when we're thinking about changing what we see every day, whether it's anti-Blackness or anti-Asian racism, because they're linked, it happens on 3 levels, right? It's individual, interpersonal, institutional. And we have to be fighting on all 3 fronts. And I mean, at the very base level, you have to sit around and ask yourself, do I know Black folks? If you are a non-Black person and you don't know Black people, I'm concerned, right? What is that Chris Rock joke? Every Black person has hella white friends, but white people only have 1 Black friend. Like, what are we doing, right? What are we doing? Are we holding community that is multiracial? Are we holding family that is multiracial? And sometimes that's tough depending on where you live. And I'm not saying that like you should find a token Black friend. That's not where I'm coming from. But I think at the very least, you start with, do I get defensive when someone says that was anti-Black? Do I show up? Do I say something when someone says something that's completely out of pocket, right? And if I don't, why? What am I afraid of? What's happening for me?
Yeah.
At the very basic level, I think we start there, right? And that's hard. But I think, you know, if we want to get free, Black folks have to get free. That's just how that works.
Yeah, and it's like that Audre Lorde quote that she was speaking specifically to women, but I think it applies in this context. And it's if I'm not free as a Black woman, no other woman is free. And it's a recognition of, even though our chains are different, none of us are free if one it's that recognition piece is really important. And I wanted to give Simone an opportunity to share, because I know she had a perspective that she wanted to share.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the floor, Janice. Yeah, I wanted to speak to the issue of visibility. And I think it has come up multiple times tonight. I got my start in corporate entertainment, so representation is something that I truly care about. And I do think part of the reason why, I'll limit it to the Asian American, Black American, African American experience. I am the child of Ghanaian immigrants as well. I'm first generation, but I'll keep it confined to experiences within the United States. I think the lack of visibility in media and the lack of ability for Asian American people to see themselves, whether it's in content or literature and politics, has, I think, spurned this feeling of needing to feel included. And sometimes that directly leads into that very precarious place of aligning with whiteness. And this feeling that in order to feel like I'm part of some broader American narrative, in addition to being, the story of Asian Americans has been one of immigration, willing immigration rather than involuntary, like African Americans. So I think that piece of that, where if you are an Asian American child and you don't see yourself in media, you don't see yourself represented, you have no real representation of yourself anywhere but within the interpersonal, your own family, your only segue into acceptance is the constant message that whiteness is the dominant, it's the culture, it's the accepted. And I think that makes it a very, very seductive drug. And I say that because at every point in American history, every ethnic group that is not essentially white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant has had their card pulled. We're experiencing it now, where at some inevitable point you have, as people call it, your N-word moment, where you are reminded that you are not part of the dominant white fabric and what constitutes acceptable Americanness. Toni Morrison once said, every white people are American, but everybody else is hyphenated. If you're part of the hyphenated crew, at some point you'll be reminded. And I think it's important for not only much more visibility for Asian Americans in media, but in addition, the constant reminder that, while acceptance is relative, and even the way in which you're accepted is conditional. You know, these stereotypes of being passive, of being quiet, you know, docile, submissive, being the quote unquote good minorities, even that is patronizing. And dismantling that and really inspecting that, and also harmful to other Asian American communities that are not maybe Chinese, Korean communities, because people forget huge swaths of the Asian American populace, you know, Cambodian Americans, Laotian Americans also suffer from high rates of systemic oppression and economic oppression. And that's not recognized. And by constantly buying into the model minority myth, even within your own communities, you are hurting each other. So there's an intra-Asian American problem where even within the Asian American community, there's a strata of who are the quote unquote good Asians and who are the quote unquote bad Asians, which is even rooted in white supremacy. So I think one of the things maybe Asian American people can do moving forward is acknowledging how white supremacy is even hurting and stifling you and preventing you from systemic growth, whether it's representation in politics, in media, you know, breaking what I think the New York Times years ago called the bamboo ceiling of why Asian Americans are not, more often than not, are not in the corporate suites. They may be in the tech companies, they may be, you know, exceeding in certain areas, but they're not in places of leadership because there's a perception of being quote unquote passive. So it's like in your rush to get acceptance and align with whiteness, you are actually hurting yourselves. So that's just kind of a perspective I wanted to share. But thank you for allowing me the time.
Simone, I want to take your class.
Thank you so much, Simone, for that perspective. And I think that looking at the bamboo ceiling, and I didn't actually know what that was until a few years ago when I had a student do a presentation on the bamboo ceiling and these invisible barriers that Asian people have to go through to be considered, I guess, qualify for these management positions and roles. It's important for the acknowledgement on our side as well as Black people. And it kind of goes to, there was a comment in the YouTube that I wanted to share that I thought was really important. And someone named Jerome says, allyship is a two-way street. Just as Asian Americans need to step up, so do we as Black Americans. Some of the people engaging in anti-Asian rhetoric and attacks have been fellow people of color. And I think we saw this, I'm not sure how many of you saw that there was a video a few months back of an Asian man who was being beat up by Black people. I think he was a homeless man. So there, we've seen that video and it was, Black people that were doing that to him. So I definitely do think that their allyship is a two-way street, and that we also have to acknowledge that we hold as Black people, we can do things that are problematic for other groups. That's an important acknowledgement and recognition that has to happen as well.
I just want to take Simone's class, but I will start here. I think that we as communities of color often feel like we're exempt from talking about our own stuff. And we're not, right? Like Asian Americans, we got to talk about our anti-Blackness, and a lot of other communities of color have to talk about the ways in which we perpetrate harm to other communities of color, because that is actually, as Toni Morrison says, just a distraction from us thriving, right? Like, and the thing that we're trying to get to is thriving. And to that point, I think one of the things that Simone said is really important, which is Asian Americans haven't just internalized the model minority thing on an individual level. We see it thrown at us in every way, shape, or form. So like still to this day, about only 2% of speaking roles are given to Asian Americans, right? And when we look at our media representation, it's not people like, I'm a very poor example of a model minority. My family doesn't have a really high net worth. I'm a first generation student. I'm gay. I was born in this country, but my family is refugees. And yeah, I have shady cousins who will do things, right? Like I'm a really bad example of what a model minority is. But when was the last time you saw my story? A story that was class diverse. So our media representation, our corporate representation, all of the things that you see that get buy-in as Asian American are generally kind of aping whiteness. And I think it's a really widespread issue, because our community is really diverse in terms of class as well. We have communities within Asian America that live in poverty at higher rates than Black and Latinx folks, but we don't talk about them when we're talking about Asian America. And so I think bringing up this conversation of, we have a lot of a platform to be in solidarity with each other. Oftentimes we're experiencing very similar things. And how are we not getting to that conversation? I think it's because of a lot of racial pain, a lot of our perceptions, and a lot of these things that have kept us from each other.
Yeah, and that's really important, the ethnicity piece, because I think similar to Africans, we all kind of get lumped, Black Americans and Africans get lumped together, without thoughts to our unique experiences, and different countries and ethnicities have different experiences, and it's important not to sort of erase that. I wanted to touch on Sydney's question, which was a really great question, and she asked, or she says, it would be great to hear about the ways that Black and Asian people could successfully collaborate in professional settings. Do you or anyone else on this call have examples of or know of any successful strategies for collaborating to support the advancement of people of color or furthering diversity and inclusion goals within organizations and industries? And I can just say that what I think is an effective strategy is I've seen Black and Hispanic employee resource groups collaborate and have an event. And I think that the same should be done if your organization has an employee resource group, collaborating with other employee resource groups, particularly the Black and Asian or API employee resource groups, collaborating on bringing in speakers or having a panel or having an event, I think is one way, particularly in the workplace, that we can work toward collective support. Kim, I don't know if you had any.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if we're getting a little bit more granular, what does it actually look like? I think a couple of the tactics that I've seen be really successful are co-sponsoring events, right? And when you have, Pride Month is right around the corner. I'm always very busy during Pride Month, but always making sure that the folks that you represent are multiracial, right? So if you have a panel, make sure that there are folks represented from every racial group on your panel, your event, your work. Translation is always a really great way to get folks, invite folks to come to your spaces and build in communities of trust. And there is a way that I think, plain and simply, at the most basic level, showing up for each other's events is really important, right? Asian folks, go to that screening of Moonlight, it's coming, you're going. For Black folks, check out our screening of the half of it. It's a landmark moment for us. There hasn't been a queer Asian woman movie in 20 years. So just showing up for the event, having your face, your body there is really, really important.
Yeah, I think the theme of this is, or one of the ways that we can build the cross-racial allyship between our communities, is showing up. I think that's really, really important. And like you said earlier, Kim, is the sharing of the stories. But Mayan had a comment that he or she wanted to share.
Hi, everyone. This is Mayan, and I'm currently living in the Bay Area. I've been here just under 2 years, and I wanted to kind of contribute some of my thoughts as I was listening to the conversation. In terms of workplace strategies, I'm very blessed to have a colleague who turned into a dear friend at my office. He happens to be an Asian man, and from the jump, we said that we were going to have each other's backs. And some of the strategies that we utilize to do that are making sure, number one, that we're in important meetings as they're set. There have been times that there was a meeting called where he absolutely should have been there, because what was talked about is what he actually led at the job, and he wasn't invited. And so as I was looking around the room, I said, wait a minute, let me text him and make sure that he's going to be here. Come to find out, he wasn't even invited. So I think that, making sure that we're in those important spaces is really important. During meetings, we reiterate each other's points. And so Myself, I identify as a black woman. My mother is a black woman. My dad is a Nigerian, and so I definitely have been at the crossroads in terms of the division between the African American community and the Nigerian community.
Mm.
And even though there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of difference as well. And what both of my parents taught me is that I should never let the differences divide me as a person because I have both of those identities in me. And I think that as we move forward to the year 2050, I think this is a great time to remind everyone what the experts have been saying. And we've been seeing this. By the year 2050, the United States is going to become a minority majority. So aligning yourself with whiteness may not be the best strategy when
Right.
it comes to maintaining whatever status you think you have. If white supremacists are the people who are making the rules of the day, understand that when 2050 comes, it doesn't mean that white supremacy and its outcomes that have been systematically in place from the inception of this country, it doesn't mean they'll go away. But at the same time, you really need to look at the allies that you have around you because we're increasing in number. And when you look at the art of war, not necessarily the book, but the true strategies of war, divide and conquer, it's an easy strategy. And as long as we are quarreling amongst ourselves, we are not taking our focus and attention to the true enemy, which is white supremacy. That's all I have to say. And I'm so grateful for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Man. I love that, and I think that that's important to remember that stat, and I think that that has caused a lot of fear in the white community, and I think that that is the cause of a lot of the. I don't want to get into that whole discussion, but I think that that's the cause of a lot of the policies and legislation that has been implemented into the country. So Dr. P said, you'd be surprised how far caring and showing you care can take you in the workplace. Dr. P, I don't know if you wanted to expound on that point, but that's really, really important as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, you guys, for hosting it. Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Dr. Kim Tran. And basically what I was going to say is what I've experienced. Like I said, I mentioned before in the chat, being African American, my experiences with various Asian cultures are different in academia and outside. In academia, we have found alliances because we quickly realized how we're all at the bottom and how our livelihood and our jobs are at stake. But even beyond just like congregating and having events where we share that we have alliances, actually like caring for people. And, you know, when coronavirus is what's happening in China, I have a colleague and I made sure to stay on it about her family and how they were doing. When I saw in meetings that, you know, she was being bullied by white people, I made sure to go to her after those meetings and let her know that I saw it. She's not crazy. And we formed a friendship after, you know, beyond our work relationship. And I think that has meant so much. And I think it has also opened up her eyes to being friends with Black people. I'm not saying go around and pander, but I'm saying showing a little bit of care, extending the olive branch could definitely help in these situations.
If I can, I want to kind of come back to bridge a little bit of what you said with our last comment. At the end of the day, allyship is a relationship of trust, of accountability, and of transparency, right? And so when we think about how we can show up for each other in the workplace, it does come down to whether or not you have a relationship. And I love the idea that you have a pod or a clique of people who show up for each other in meetings, because that is actually the interpersonal piece of social change, right? And unless you have a relationship of trust with a person, you've been to a happy hour, you've been to dinner at the house, you're not going to get to the point where they're like, I'm a Black person and I keep getting badged by security. I get badged by security 10 times a day. I can't support somebody in that unless I have a relationship in which I know them and they can trust me enough to tell them that, or that they can trust me enough to tell me that, right? And so it's about trust, but it's also about proving to each other, and this doesn't go just one way, proving to each other that we can show up in a deft way, whether it's in a meeting or in an all hands or whatever it is. right? So that the person most impacted by that moment isn't the one who has to raise their hand and say, actually, you did a racist thing to me again. That's what we're trying to alleviate. We're trying to alleviate the sense of the same person having to say, that was homophobic and I'm gay over and over and over again, right? Whatever that may mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the way that you build, like you said, Dr. Kim, the relationship of trust is, I think part of it's having the conversations. I would look at, just assessing who your circle is and your circle of friends and just looking at that. And what you're doing to really show up for your Black friends and colleagues and coworkers. And like Dr. P said, simply showing you care and just texting someone and saying, I see what's going on in the news. Are you okay? It's such a small gesture, but it means the world to people. So I think that is also, you have to think about the ways in which you're building that relationship of trust in order to be a good or effective ally or an advocate. So we're at the 9 o'clock point, and I definitely want to be respectful of people's time. And I know usually we keep these at an hour. So did anyone else have any final thoughts before we log off? I've been keeping my eye on the chat.
I would like to, if that's okay,
Yeah.
to kind of answer the question, Sheree Myrick's, she, her. One way that we've been able in academia again to have collaboration is that when my role as director of diversity was vacant for 2 years, it was an Asian woman that not only stood up as a grassroots worker and a professor from Duke, she actually took on supervising that office and a coordinator. She also conducted the climate survey. So without her work, we would be nowhere. And we also awarded her a diversity award, our champion award. Number two, I also have been telling a lot of our faculty and staff about the extension of the issue of DACA, and that DACA is just not limited to our Latinx community, but that we have our second largest population is Asia, actually second, is Asian, and then Black, and then 10% white and 1% other. And that's important as we are on this this crux of the Supreme Court about to make that decision, that it is a issue, as you both have been talking so wonderfully with this wonderful talk tonight, that this is where we can collaborate, we can work together, and that this struggle is everyone's struggle. It isn't just limited to the typical image that you might see as a DACA person. And so that's just one, bringing those, dismissing those stereotypes, bringing the statistics in, and then having that conversation on the why, what, how do we get here, to make sure that folks have the buy-in, and that white folks are like, wow, I'm really stereotypical and I should check myself and educate myself, because I did not know that the Asian community, regardless of what continent they came from, or east, west, north side, whoever, that this affects a whole different population that you never thought before. So those are just some strategies that we've been employing. So finding the Asian change agents, I hate allies, that are vocal, utilizing them, and then especially if they are smart, utilizing them as we would do any person, to get the leverage and come together and work together.
Thank you so much, Sheree. And I definitely agree. And I'm kind of moving away from the allyship, but I love that finding those change agents who want to help, who want to show up for you and then I think it's important also just having these conversations, because it's important to share our experiences, but also focus on, like, how do we move forward? How do we highlight and build this bridge? And Dr. Kim, at the beginning of the conversation, you shared with me an organization that does foster this cross-racial allyship between the community. So before we head out, did you want to share that with everyone? And people are asking about your lipstick as well. And I think it's amazing, and I complimented you on it in the beginning. So right. If you could share that as well.
Sure. So a couple things. I think the thing, because there's so little Asian representation, that we tend to forget is that there are rooted Asian American organizations that are doing anti-Blackness work and have been for a while. So I'll start by saying if you're on the East Coast, you might want to look to CAV, CAAAV. They do, around the time of the Ferguson uprisings, they were doing door knocking campaigns with Asian Americans to call them in on their anti-Blackness, to have hard conversations about anti-Blackness. Asians for Black Lives, A4BL, is a national organization. So, or not an organization, it's a group of organizers. They're here in California. They're also on the West Coast, or also on the East Coast. So A4BL is around, CAV is around, SALT, ASADA, these are for South Asian folks. And so I think the thing that I generally try to leave folks with is, while things are very challenging, we have a lot of reason to kind of take heart in this moment, right? I live a very blessed life in which I look around and folks are thinking in really creative ways about what it looks like to live in a world without racism. And there are really beautiful answers to that question, and they're all very diverse and all very different. So I really hope that folks can plug in to some of this work and be reminded that despite what you may see in media, despite the kind of controlling images, as Dr. Collins likes to say, controlling images that we see about Black folks and about Asian folks, we're out here, we're doing the work. And this call is a really beautiful example. So I'm really grateful for the time. Oh, my lipstick is Stila. It's a color called Beso.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kim. I love that. Love the lipstick. And thank you all so much for joining. I hope we all can connect on LinkedIn, and definitely follow Dr. Kim. She's great on LinkedIn. And I hope we can have more conversations like this. And I hope you all enjoyed. And so this will be up on the YouTube if anyone else wants to share or rewatch. So I will see you all later. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.
Well, good night, everybody.